Welcome back. So it is Tuesday morning, and you are preparing for a leadership team meeting, which is scheduled the next day, one where there needs to be decisions that are made and teams are waiting for direction. And you are reviewing the materials that everyone has sent one last time. And one of those sections is owned by another department. You open it and you immediately see the issue. The analysis is partial, there's some key inputs that are missing, and there are even some assumptions that haven't been worked through. So there's no ambiguity here. This isn't the first time this has happened. And this is a department where you have to give a lot of input. And you've flagged it before, you've been very clear about what is needed, and you know that there isn't a lot of time for some back and forth. So you pause and you make a very conscious decision. You can send it back, and in that case, you risk delaying the decision, or you can step in and finish the work yourself and keep things moving. If you are like my client, he chooses to step in. Again, not because he was unclear about the roles and the responsibilities and who owns what, and not because he didn't see what is happening, but because he chose to step in because the decision mattered. And he didn't want the business absorbing the impact of somebody else's not doing their job. So by the end of the day, the work is done, the meeting will happen, the decisions will be made, but you are still irritated. You're not uncertain, you're irritated because you are very clear about what just happened. So let's name this accurately. This isn't a question of motivation, it's not about commitment, and it's not about your skill set or competence. The real issue, if you are stepping in to fix something that somebody else should be doing, is that you are compensating for a gap in execution or in ownership. And when you are consistently compensating like that, what gradually shifts is accountability. Without anyone really explicitly agreeing to that shift. You are making a deliberate call. You are taking on work that isn't yours. Now, you're doing it, I know, for good reasons, to protect outcomes that matter, to protect outcomes for the business. And of course, in isolation, that decision makes 100% sense. But when it becomes the default reaction or the default response, it stops being a choice and it becomes the way things work. And at that point, you are no longer just helping, you are quietly changing how responsibility is, I would say, maybe distributed around you, or the responsibility that's landing on your plate. Now, here's why this matters. Beyond the immediate frustration, which is real and is felt and can create a lot of resentment if this happens over and over. But it matters because, first of all, it affects judgment. When this pattern sets in, an urgency starts driving decisions more than ownership. And what needs to be done here is that urgency takes precedent over who is accountable for it. And over that time, that is pulling you as a senior leader closer to operational execution and further away from senior level judgment that you're actually there to provide. Second, it affects timing. Because you're stepping in late to correct issues, the underlying problem of that other department never doing their job correctly, it never surfaces enough to be dealt with properly. So by the time you could address it, you've already absorbed it, which means nothing has changed. But thirdly, it also affects your authority, not like in your face, loud authority, but this quiet undermining of your authority. Others begin to assume that you'll catch things. And accountability becomes less explicit. And without anybody intending it, like more responsibility lands on your desks. And it creates a constant background load, like energy and what's going on in your mind, because you're tracking or thinking about dependencies and anticipating gaps and managing risk that technically doesn't sit with you. And that mental overload builds, and it also allows actually less time for you to do your job. So there are a few distinctions that to kind of reframe this. The first is the difference between being dependable and being accountable. Dependability is about making sure that things don't fall off the rails. Accountability is about who owns that. And at a very senior level, your effectiveness comes from ensuring outcomes through clear ownership, not by personally absorbing whatever isn't managed or handled by other departments. You are just enabling them if you are stepping in all the time. The second distinction is between fixing problems and allowing responsibility to surface. Right now, in this situation, you're very good at fixing problems. You step in before the issues become visible. But when problems never surface, then responsibility for that other department, that just never happens. And nothing improves because the consequences never land where they should. The third distinction is between short-term protection and long-term strength. And what I mean by that is stepping in feels responsible, and it often is in the moment. But when it becomes your habit, it's actually having a negative effect on the organization because it weakens the organization's ability to operate without you. So let's think about it differently. There's a cross-functional initiative, you're heading into a decision meeting, and this other department owns part of the analysis. Their contribution, again, arrives late and incomplete. And your instinct is to step in. But let's think if you approach this differently. You don't have to be emotional about it. You don't have to be confrontational about it. But you do have to be intentional about how you want to manage the situation. Because if you're like my clients, you still care about the outcome, you still care about the business, and you want that decision to be solid. But instead of redoing the work, you make the problem explicit. State what's missing, identify who owns it, and explain the impact on the decision if their work isn't done or resolved. You don't have to escalate it. You don't have to create drama. It's just accurate feedback given in time. And if you are doing that regularly, what changes? So in the short term, yes, it feels uncomfortable. I 100% hear that. But over time, something important happens. Expectations become clearer. Ownership becomes harder to avoid. And responsibility stops shifting towards you or that person who always steps in. You're still fully committed, but you've now put up a boundary. So when this situation shows up, and it will, I want you to think about it this way. Ask yourself, what needs to be made visible here? So instead of asking yourself, should I take this on? Should I do it? Ask, okay, what is the problem that we need to show or make visible? So pay attention to, where your commitment has quietly turned into substitution. Because of course there are always rules, exception to the rules, you can step in. But if it is consistent, then that is simply a new way of working. Staying accountable to outcomes is of course part of senior leadership, but taking on work that isn't yours repeatedly, that is not. One strengthens the organization and the other actually is putting weight and strain in the wrong place. If you are feeling the weight of this pattern, because it's something I hear regularly from my clients, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means you're capable, dependable, and invested, and the organization, of course, values that and has learned to rely on it. But senior leadership is also knowing when to step in and when to step back, because stepping back in the long run is going to help and support the organization. If you want to talk through this on how this is playing out in your role, calmly, practically, and finding a very practical solution that works for you, I would invite you to book a 15-minute free executive pulse call. We'll look at the situation together and get you back into doing your role that feels both effective and sustainable. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll talk soon.